You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas. This week, we are starting off a new episode, and we wanted to cover a couple of things that we've been talking with you about, as well as some new topics. We wanted to thank everybody for making contributions to the Durham Jane Doe project that we're working on with our friends at Othram Labs in Texas. Durham Police Department in beautiful Durham, North Carolina, are working to identify the remains of a young woman named Durham Jane Doe for this moment. You may recall that we had asked you to consider making a donation, either financial or your DNA, or both, to help Durham Police and Othram Labs identify Jane Doe. What we know about her is she's about 25 to 35 years old. Sadly, her remains were found in 2016 in a storage unit that had been rented in 2010. The man who had rented the storage unit is dead, so he cannot answer questions about who she might be. But we're trying to identify a woman who is 25 to 35 years old. She may be mixed race. We're not sure if this is a homicide yet. Hopefully, we'll be able to determine that as the lab work moves forward. Obviously, it's a very strange and sad situation for a young woman's remains to be found in a storage locker like this. Hopefully, with DNA results perhaps in about 12 weeks, with your help in contributing your DNA to Othram's website, DNAsolved.com, and your financial support. There's a goal of $5,000, and we are moving forward with raising funds to cover the $5,000 costs of the lab tests that will hopefully identify Durham Jane Doe. We'd really appreciate your support. We look forward to seeing our numbers grow and the number of participants, including ourselves, contribute DNA to DNAsolved.com to help law enforcement solve cases like Durham Jane Doe and others around the country. Thanks for your support.
And in other true crime news, we wanted to go ahead and discuss another disturbing and upsetting death in Fort Hood, Texas. On Tuesday, the body of Elder Fernandez, 23 years old, of Brockton, Massachusetts, was found outside of Lake Polk, which is in Temple, Texas. He had been reported missing on August 18th, and he was found on August 25th hanging from a tree. Mr. Fernandez was a chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear specialist at Fort Hood. He was last seen on August 18th, but he did not report to work as scheduled on that day. Now, interestingly, his vehicle was found on base, and other unit members did say that they felt he had left of his own accord. We don't know how he eventually got 30 miles away from base, but his car was found on base. And to thicken the plot just a little bit, we do know that he had transferred units after reporting sexual abuse by his sergeant at Fort Hood. The investigation into that is still open. Right, interestingly enough, Elder Fernandez is the third service member at Fort Hood who was found dead this summer. Of course, everyone has heard of Vanessa Guillen, her disappearance and murder. And earlier this summer was Gregory Morales. His body was discovered in June after having last been seen 10 months prior, and foul play is suspected in that case. Elder Fernandez is the 13th Fort Hood soldier to have vanished or been killed on base in 2020. And that is a extremely worrisome problem that I'm hoping Fort Hood is taking great lengths to investigate and attempt to rectify.
My concern is that Fort Hood is not taking sufficient steps to investigate these murders. And Army Criminal Investigation Division has issued very odd statements in several of these cases. A few months ago, they released a statement saying they didn't think that Vanessa Guillen's murder was related to her complaints of being sexually harassed by her superiors. To be frank, they were dead wrong. It turned out that the man who had been sexually harassing her committed suicide when investigators closed in to his home in an attempt to speak to him. In this Fernandez case, despite the fact that Elder Fernandez is found 30 miles outside the base and his vehicle is back on base, and as you pointed out, Kristin, how exactly did Sergeant Fernandez get to this location where he hung himself from a tree? And I know we only have a limited amount of information based on the media reports, but this just doesn't wash for me. Army CID seems to be much more concerned with shutting down media interest and speculation and family concerns about these young people being found murdered than they are in getting to the bottom of whatever's happening. Many people who listen to this podcast know I come from a military family. I think there is such a serious breach of trust here with the United States Army and these young people serving at Fort Hood. I find it frightening that this massive military base seems to be teetering on almost being out of control. I recognize it's a massive facility and hundreds of thousands of people may cycle through there in a year, but it feels like horrible things are happening on and off base and nobody seems to be in charge. I think there's a very serious problem there. I know, Kristin, you and I have discussed the fact that we would like to spend more time on the Fort Hood murders and disappearances, and I know we'll be doing that in coming weeks. As someone who comes from a military family, I'm really concerned that we are sending young people into the Army and they end up at Fort Hood and then they end up dying in extremely violent and mysterious ways. It's also worth mentioning that just recently a story broke that there was a child trafficking sex ring, a real one, not fictitious, that was just broken up in Texas. And 2 of the, I think, 9 people that were arrested within the last week or so, they were Fort Hood soldiers themselves. I just feel like there's something off about what's going on here at Fort Hood. And I think this deserves more media attention and more discussion from the families of these missing and murdered people, not less.
Absolutely. And that is something that we are looking forward to spending a little bit more time on as we move forward. We are going to go ahead and get into a new case this week. And this is the case of Donna Hall and Mike Margaret, 2 young people who were murdered in Henrico County, Virginia in August of 1984. This is a double homicide. Both Donna and Mike were murdered quite viciously with a knife. Their murder has sometimes been linked to that of the Colonial Parkway Murders, which Bill and I, of course, are both heavily involved with. Their case does remain unsolved to this day. And because this is such an interesting case to us and one that is near and dear to our hearts, we are going to cover it over several episodes. So our guest for this week is Blue Hall. He is a classmate of Donna Hall's. He is not related to her. I know they share the same last name. They are not related. And Blue is our resident expert on the Donna Hall and Mike Margaret murders. He is going to be joining us for the next several episodes to discuss everything that he knows about the case and the Facebook group that he co-administrates about the Donna Hall and Mike Margaret murders. Because we have so much to say about the case, we are forgoing our usual episode in which Bill and I report to each other and have color commentary to go along with it, in favor of just jumping right in with Blue Hall, who knows far more about the case and can give us a lot more information and detail. So for this week, we are happy to introduce you to Blue Hall, who is going to discuss the Donna Hall and Mike Margaret murders from 1984.
Hello and welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Bill Thomas.
And I'm Kristin Dilley.
This week, we are starting an exploration of a new case for us, the Donna Hall Mike Margaret case, which dates to 1984. We'll get into more details in a minute. The case is a Virginia case of a young couple. Because of some of the basic circumstances of the case, it has often been linked to the Colonial Parkway Murders, and we'll explore that as well. So joining us to help us understand what is truly a fascinating case and a long-time unsolved homicide in Virginia is Eric Blue Hall. Of course, one of the questions we need to get into with Blue is where the nickname comes from. But first of all, let's say hello. Hey, Blue.
Hey, Bill. Hey, Kristin. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're very excited about it. So actually, let's start with that. Where does a guy whose name is Eric Hall end up being called Blue? Where does Blue come from?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, my dad was in the military. He was a retired veteran in the Army from World War II in Korea. And he and my mom were living in Las Vegas at the time. And my dad would have these parties, and his sergeants would come over. You know, he was an officer. He had earned a battlefield commission in World War II. His sergeants would come over. I had these giant blue eyes, and all their wives would always say, "Show them your eyes, Blue." And the name just stuck. So all my life, it's been Blue, even through college, so it's kind of funny.
So did your mom and dad end up calling you Blue?
Oh, yeah, for sure. My dad ended up dying when I was very young. But,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, the name stuck. That's okay. It happened.
Yeah, actually, it's a nice legacy of your dad. Did your dad have the blue eyes too?
He did. Yeah, I get comments all the time how similar we are in appearance.
Now, does anybody call you Eric?
Not a single person. In fact, you introduced me as Eric, and it kind of threw me for a loop because I'm not used to hearing it.
So, tell us a little bit more about yourself. Where you grew up, that kind of thing.
Okay, well, like I said, we were living in Las Vegas when I was born. My dad had recently retired from the Army, but was working as a civilian contractor for the military. So I was born in Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas, and shortly after that, my dad went into juvenile corrections, and he eventually, when I think I was maybe a year or two old, got offered a job in Richmond, not in Richmond, but just outside of Richmond at a place called Beaumont School for Boys. It was a live-in detention home for 18 and under kids. And Beaumont at the time, they also called it the farm at Beaumont. They had developed a pretty bad reputation for their treatment of the inmates. And also they had a bad reputation for sexual assaults there among the inmate population. So my dad was brought in to kind of clean up that whole mess. And Beaumont was kind of an interesting place because the inmates lived in these barrack-style basements, and above the basement in the main houses, they called them cottages, and they were all labeled letter names. We lived in Cottage O. So we go through there's a door in our kitchen that walked down a set of stairs to where the inmates slept, and down there they had a recreation center and all that, and that's where they lived. But my dad ended up dying a few years after that. We were living in the west end of Richmond, Henrico County, to be exact, at the time. And my mom, who hadn't worked in a very long time, in fact, she couldn't even drive a car, was kind of just stuck there with us three kids. And she became a cafeteria lady for the public school system there in Henrico. And I grew up, just normal, without a dad for a number of years until she remarried. But, I played baseball, went to church, went to school, and eventually moved to L.A. A job brought me out here, and that's where I still, reside to this day.
Mm-hmm.
What is your relationship to the two victims in this case, Donna Hall and Mike Margaret? I know you share the same last name with Donna Hall, but you are not related, correct?
That is correct. Donna and I are not related. However, it's kind of a funny story. I met Donna on the first day of 7th grade at Byrd Middle School in Henrico County. Byrd has since been renamed to, I think, Quioccasin Middle School or something like that. But, I was typically a shy kid. And unless I was on the baseball field, then I was very outgoing. Donna and I were in the same homeroom together. And so it was kind of a big deal in 7th grade. It was like the first grade you got assigned a locker. with a combination you had to memorize, and so it was like a little nerve-wracking for me.
Yeah.
But they took us out in the hallway, and all the lockers were assigned alphabetically. So Donna and I's last name was the same, so we were right next to each other. So one of her first questions to me was, when were you born? And I told her my birth date, and she was a few months older than me, and she said, well, all right, from now on, I'm your big sister. I'm going to watch out for you.
Aww.
And so we had our lockers next to each other for 6 years, through Burr Middle School and then through
into high
Douglas
school.
Freeman.
Right.
Yeah. So, we never developed a close friendship, but she was always very nice, very outgoing. I watched her change over the years. We'll get into that later, but she was just an earthy girl, just happy, just nice to everybody. And that's how I knew Donna,
Let me ask a question, too, for the benefit. We have, listeners all over the world and a number of people in Virginia. For people that have never been to Henrico County, Virginia, is it rural? Is it suburban? What's it like?
It's mostly suburban. The city of Richmond, which is the capital of Virginia, is surrounded on three sides by Henrico County, the west end, the north side, and the east end, right? On the south side, you have Chesterfield County. It's mostly across the river. It's a diverse, Henrico County is very diverse. We have, low income, you've got middle class, you've got some very, very wealthy people in certain areas.
Are some of those towns bedroom towns then for people that might work in Richmond?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. A lot of people would commute into the city for work and entertainment.
So let's talk a little bit more about how does a guy who is, you described yourself as not a close friend of Donna Hall, and we haven't talked about Mike Margaret yet. How did you get involved in this murder case?
Back in 2015, so just 5 years ago, another classmate of mine, a guy by the name of Kevin Riley, who currently works for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, at least I still think he works there, had posted an article on our Douglas Freeman High School alumni Facebook group. And it was a link to an article by Henrico Monthly Magazine on this case. And he posted it with a simple comment, "Isn't it about time?" or something similar. And so that Facebook thread took off. I mean, we had somewhere near 500, 600, 700 comments within a day or two. And it was quickly apparent to the admin of that group, Rob Hollins, who I know you've spoken to. Rob is the admin of that Facebook group and others. And Rob's a great guy. He spearheads and organizes a lot of the extracurricular alumni activities, from fundraising, golf tournaments, to Vietnam War memorials, veteran war memorials. And he's put in so much work over the years, taken a lot of hits sometimes for adminning a Facebook group. As you know, it can be difficult.
Yeah.
A lot of people.
Kristin and I are looking at each other and saying, yes, that is true, because we do the Colonial Parkway Murders.
Rob's done a terrific job, and so he contacted me. Now, Rob grew up in a house right next to the house my mom bought once my dad passed away. She took his GI package and bought a house, and so Rob was a few years older than me, and so he reached out to me and said, hey, we need to make a dedicated Facebook group for that murder. And I thought it was a brilliant idea. And so we had a bunch of people volunteering to be admins, to let people into the group, kind of moderate it. And we had no idea what we were getting into, Bill and Kristin. It became a full-time job at first. It was apparent that murder still hit home with a lot of people. Emotions were running high. People started commenting on Mike and Donna. Our whole goal for that page was basically to bring awareness to the case and keep people talking. Hey, maybe the police will get some new information, right? That page also took off, not only from students at Freeman, but, Mike Margaret, who was Donna's boyfriend, who I didn't know Mike. We never met, but he went to a competing high school, just down the road. A lot of kids from that class, that era, started joining, and other high schools, some of the private high schools around, and, and members of the press and the police, it just took off. And so here we are working, our butts off trying to organize this information. And, Facebook isn't the ideal platform for organizing information.
Oh, not at all.
That's easily accessible and coherent, for lack of a better word. So things were just kind of scattered all over the place. Rob also had the idea to put topic cards as photographs into Facebook. And we'll have that pinned at the top. You pick a topic, you can read about it. The circumstances among the, in the case, the crime scene photos, what it looked like then, what it looks like now, timelines of Mike and Donna separately and together, things that were happening around the area at the time, including other crimes, social events, the weather, you name it, it's there. It was a lot of work, but, it really paid off. Several other law enforcement agencies got wind of it, and the success that Henrico detectives were having gathering this information, and reached out to us and said, hey, how'd you do this? What kind of challenges did you face? So we kind of helped others along as well. Not only that, but we had other families of crime victims reach out to us for help, from across the country. I've got a person in Georgia, a person in Texas, a person in Arkansas, asking for our advice on setting up a group and getting the most from it.
I was going to say, yours is the only group that I'm aware of. Kristin may have observations here too. I've never seen anybody else organize a discussion on Facebook in this way. And it's actually very interesting to group things by the topic cards. And it does make reading through a thread a lot easier for someone like us, or I would imagine someone in law enforcement or whatever, journalists, etc., to be able to read a bunch of different observations by topic, not organized, as most of us know, Facebook is organized chronologically. So you've got the latest post.
Yeah, it's not perfect. It would be a lot easier if we could move a post that was just in the general comment section, move it to a topic card. But Facebook doesn't allow that. Sometimes if it's really important, we'll write to the poster and say, hey, can you repost this under this topic? But it just became too much to manage. We're just over. We just hit our 3,000 member about 2 weeks ago.
Congratulations. That's excellent.
Yeah, it is. It's we hovered around 2,800 for the last 5 years, but gradually it's just increased. So.
And it's a very interesting, active group of participants, and a lot of people that seem to have a personal connection to the area, the victims, the case, what was going on back then. One of the most frequent questions we're asked here at Mind Over Murder is, how can I help?
Thanks to Othram, a leading forensic DNA testing lab for law enforcement, you can get involved and help solve real cases.
If you have tested at a consumer genetics company, you can contribute your data to DNAsolves.com. The process is easy and confidential. Just 2 simple steps. Your DNA might be the missing piece that helped solve the identity of an unknown person.
Then Mind Over Murder will highlight cases Othram is working on to seek your crowdfunding support for DNA testing to help solve these cold cases.
Upload your DNA profile to DNAsolves.com. It's easy, free, and confidential.
Then join Mind Over Murder as we help families find answers with Othram and DNAsolves.com. Do you like our show, Mind Over Murder, and want to create your own podcast?
Well then, let us tell you about Anchor.
First of all, it's free. And who doesn't love free, right?
I like free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer.
You can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before.
Anchor will then distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more platforms.
And you can even make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership.
I like the sound of that. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Right here, Anchor.
Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started on your own podcast.
You can tell them Kristin and Bill from Mind Over Murder sent you.
That's for sure. We've got a variety of people, a variety of types of people that participate. Some people don't participate publicly, but will message us admins privately and give us encouragement. Thank us for what we're doing, which we don't hear enough, by the way.
Same.
In fact, yeah. I mean, we've got I think most of the members were students of those high schools in that era. A lot of family members. In fact, a lot of people didn't know that Mike was adopted when he was younger. It was when his parents, didn't think they could have children. And then, of course, after they adopted Mike, they had Scott and Allison. So they grew up with an older adopted brother. But that family was great. They're so nice. They treated Mike no different. But Mike's birth mother is a member of our group.
Oh, I've never heard this.
Yeah, in fact, if you go to the files section of that Facebook group, you can download some Richmond Times-Dispatch articles. I try to keep them all together. I know I need to do some updating, but life's gotten the best of me lately. I haven't had time. There's an article in there about his birth mother, finding out who Mike was, after he was killed.
Oh,
man.
What it turns out is interesting. She ended up living about 1.5 miles away from his home where he grew up.
Oh, wow.
I know. Isn't that crazy?
Jeez.
So she's an active participant, and my heart goes out to her and Scott and Allison. We just want to hope this case gets resolved.
I was going to say, before we get too terribly much further into the details about the Facebook group, can you go ahead and walk us through the basics of the case?
Yeah, I can. I just want to be careful again because we've worked very closely with police over the last 5 years. A lot of people were still reluctant to go directly to the police, so they would reach out to us instead. And of course, we would pass every detail along to the police. And, I don't want to say we were investigating anything, but information came our way, so we figured out certain things related to this case that are not public knowledge. And police have asked at times, hey, just keep this to yourself. We don't want this to get out because we don't want to step on their toes and doing their job, right? Because their job's hard enough, especially in these times, So, but the basics of the case, Mike and Donna were recent high school graduates of competing high schools in Henrico County. That's the west end of Henrico. Mike, as some of your listeners will probably figure out, Mike was 21 years old when he was murdered. So that's pretty old for a high school graduate, right? Well, he had dropped out of high school earlier, and he had come back to finish his, to get his diploma, which I thought was fantastic. A lot of kids wouldn't have the courage to do that, He had started a job with Virginia Power, which was the local electric company. He had gotten that job through the dad of his best friend, Ronnie. And he had been working there, I think, maybe just less than 2 weeks, or it was a very short time. I don't know exactly the time frame there. And Donna was a clerical worker, and they had planned a weekend getaway. In fact, we're recording this on Monday, August 17th, 2020. Their excursion was to begin 36 years ago today. Yeah, so Mike, they had planned to go camping, and Mike had picked up Donna when he got off of work around 9 p.m. on Friday, August 17th, and they drove to Mike's house where they were going to get some camping gear and spoke with, Mike's parents briefly, and then they visited a friend's house not too far away from his parents' house and did some socializing there. And they made 1 or 2 stops after that that aren't well documented, but pretty much nobody ever saw them alive again. Their bodies were found, I think, 4 days later on Tuesday, the 21st, just, a couple dozen yards from where Donna lived. She lived in an apartment complex called King's Crossing in the near west end of Richmond, Henrico County, in a wooded area, and their bodies had been there for, 3 days at least, from what I've read.
So they never made it out of town.
That's correct.
They never left for the camping trip.
That is correct. Yeah, the weather at the time was rainy. I mean, that area had experienced torrential rains. It was hot. It was humid, and as you can imagine, bodies sitting outside for 3.5 days would not be a pretty sight. They had sustained multiple stab wounds each. Their throats had both been slashed. Mike had a tremendous amount of defensive wounds on his hands and body. Talking to investigators, they were adamant about what a heroic battle he was in, for his life. And Donna had no defensive wounds, but just, overkill knife wounds. No reason for it, really. Autopsy later revealed both bodies had both consumed Demerol just hours, before their death. Mike had less Demerol in him than Donna. It was described to me. Investigators said that Donna had a copious amount of Demerol in her system, to the point where she was like a bowl of Jell-O. It was unlikely she could even stand up at this point with that much Demerol in her system.
Now, is Demerol used as a party drug? I'm less familiar with Demerol.
I've become familiar with Demerol just in recent years. I can say in 1984, I had no idea what Demerol was. I don't think I had even heard of it at that point. It's a prescription painkiller. So, yeah, I don't know if people used it as a party drug back then. It's possible, but where that Demerol came from, because, it's surprising to Mike's friends because they had no idea, no recollection of Demerol. They had never heard of it either. So investigators have commented, for years, that the key to solving this case may be how'd they get that Demerol in their system? What form was it taken? Was it ingested? Was it injected? Was it inhaled? We don't know.
Kristin, you were saying there are a number of different ways you can take Demerol?
Yeah, I was checking the FDA website a little earlier just to kind of, see, because I've heard of Demerol, but I didn't know precisely what it did. And they were describing it as being very similar to morphine. And it is water soluble. You can crush it, you can chew it, you can snort it, or you can inject it. So it sounds like any of those things would have been a viable possibility for how you could take it. But I mean, yeah, it's used as a sedative and a painkiller. So I don't know, it didn't sound like a party drug to me, but again, in 1984, I was 3 years old. So that was precisely to make you feel old, Bill.
Well, you always do. But seriously, and Blue, you kind of touched on this too. We, in talking about this case, we have to remember this is 36 years ago. So, for example, the scourge of opiates that we're seeing around the country and around the world, that's not going on as much back then. I was less familiar with.
I beg to differ.
Okay.
I beg to differ.
No, please feel free. Go ahead.
A lot of drugs were available socially back then. Cocaine had just started making its way to the suburbs.
Right.
We can document cases that may be related to this case of a lot of cocaine being brought into the area. Marijuana was in abundance.
Right. Agreed.
Really, I saw that firsthand, or at least heard of it firsthand back then. Opiates, I know for, just people reaching out to me since our Facebook group started, there was a lot of kids from Freeman High School that worked at a place called Westbury Pharmacy, which was right next door to the high school. A lot of kids had part-time jobs there, working the lunch counter or delivering drugs. They offered a drug delivery service. Westbury Pharmacy, up until just a couple years ago, has had multiple instances of mismanaging their pharmacy. And it's well documented in newspaper articles, in court hearings. And I think they just lost their license, their pharmaceutical license a number of years ago because of the same thing. And people had, reached out to me saying, we stole drugs from that place all the time. We sold them to our friends. Wow. Nobody would comment specifically on Demerol, but a lot of other different drugs. I don't remember exactly what now, but it's all in my notes. And drugs were in abundance there, and I think investigators know that, and probably the key to this case.
Funny, you mentioned something a minute ago that I wanted to circle back on. I want to be clear in asking these type of questions. I'm not in any way, shape, or form throwing Donna and Mike under the bus. What happened to them is absolutely horrible. So in probing some of these areas, I'm not criticizing them or trying to say that any reference to drug use is somehow letting a killer or killers off the hook. Far from it. You mentioned Donna and Mike made several stops, social stops that evening. Friday night, if I'm correct. There was some significant partying going on at those stops. Am I correct?
One, perhaps. There was a small gathering that's well documented in these articles. Some very close friends of Mike were sitting around. I wouldn't even call it a party. They were just hanging out. It was Friday night. The night was about to start. They were sitting around drinking beers, smoking a little bit of marijuana. It was no big deal. It wasn't significant partying. There was no hard drugs. Those guys did not do hard drugs.
Mm-hmm.
You also see in those articles that Mike and Donna had a large amount of cash on them.
Right.
Which brings us, to a whole different part of the case. When their bodies were discovered that Tuesday, the cash was gone. There were rumors, information to point at the fact or the possibility that Donna was planning to buy a large amount of drugs to support a Grateful Dead tour that fall. She was a big Grateful Dead fanatic. Those shows go. It's an event. It's a lifestyle.
Yeah, my brother's a Dead fan. We're very familiar with this.
Yeah, let's spend a minute on this, Blue. For the benefit of our younger listeners who are, I know there are Dead offshoots to this day. Describe a little bit of the Deadhead culture and following the band from town to town.
Oh, I'd probably be the last person to describe that. I really, back then I was a rock music kind of guy. I wasn't a fan of the Dead.
Me too.
I have since learned to respect their music. They were musical geniuses. But yeah, back then I wasn't a fan. I never went to a show. Kristin would probably be more qualified to comment on that. But, I just know people would go, they'd camp out for days or weeks. They'd follow the band around from show to show.
Right,
They'd have tailgating. Maybe tailgating was invented at Grateful Dead concerts.
Probably. But, somewhere between there and a football stadium.
Of drug use. Yeah, a lot of drug use. Mostly marijuana probably, but acid. They were just mostly a mellow bunch of people, From what I gather. I don't know for a fact.
Yeah. I worked in the music business for a number of years. I'm very familiar with the Dead. I'm not a fan. But culturally, I have to admire the relationship that the Grateful Dead had with their fans and this incredible loyalty that people had to this band. And, what we now think of as jam bands. The Grateful Dead, New Riders of the Purple Sage, and a bunch of mostly West Coast bands initially kind of invented this style. Some of it's a little bit based on jazz with heavy improvisation, but there's this idea among Deadheads culturally that you want to see as many shows as possible because the band would make a significant effort to do songs differently every night, different solo sections. They try to play different material, never play the same set list twice. This idea of following the band has been a phenomenon for decades. It's not a group that, in my opinion, is strongly associated with violence. As a matter of fact, far from it. It's a pretty mellow group. It's funny, when you were first describing the drug use, I was thinking it's sort of softer drugs, although Jerry Garcia, the leader of the Grateful Dead, was a longtime heroin addict who ultimately has passed away, and other members of the band have died from overdose and other abuse. But I don't associate the band with a violent outlook. If anything, they're a bunch of hippies traveling from town to town. But this caravan of fans would follow them from town to town. So there's been some conversation that Donna and Mike may have been planning to follow the Grateful Dead for perhaps a couple of shows or more.
Yeah, sure. Economies have been built on Grateful Dead touring. Bootleg tapes were huge, especially with the Grateful Dead. Like this, they did different shows all the time. People are out there with those old tape recorders just taping the show, and then they would sell them for $1 or $2 or however much at the next show, and just keep making copies. And, they're out there on the internet now. Look up YouTube, Grateful Dead bootlegs. There are abundance of them out there. So I thought that was great. Yeah, nobody associated with, that group with violence. They were just kind of earthy people, having a good time, just following their favorite band around. And those shows were a huge boost to the economy of those towns they visited. In fact, what is interesting, and we'll get into this later probably, is, let's see, police had developed early leads, and there was one particular guy they wanted to talk to, and he was the son of an investment banker in Richmond, a very wealthy family, and he was following the Grateful Dead around for a year after Donna and Mike's murder. The Grateful Dead played September, I think, of 1984, so that was just a month after Donna and Mike were murdered. And when the Grateful Dead returned to Richmond in 1985, the Henrico County Police and the City of Richmond Police were waiting, looking for this one guy. In fact, they had an informant, this guy. They had an informant pointing out drug dealers, and the police made hundreds of arrests of all those Grateful Dead heads. The Grateful Dead never returned to Richmond again. And, it was tradition for them to play Richmond. Instead, they went 90 miles southeast to, Hampton or Norfolk or, one of those other venues.
So they
never came back to Richmond. In fact, the promoter of that concert had a big impact. A lot of other big names never returned to Richmond. This murder had a huge impact on the Richmond economy for decades.
Touring rock bands began avoiding the Richmond market and doing tour stops elsewhere in Virginia because of this crackdown. Wow.
Because of that crackdown, which was a result of this murder, this double homicide.
Wow.
Yeah.
Talk about ripples in a pond having,
Yeah, we'll get back to that informant later.
Yeah. Let me, this large amount of cash that Donna had, can we put a figure to that? Do we know how much money we're talking about?
I've heard anywhere between $2,000 and $5,000, which, that's a significant amount of money then.
Yes.
That would buy a small new car, I think, $5,000 back then, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. The rumor or the speculation that they were going to be buying cocaine to sell at Grateful Dead shows. I mean, was there a lot of cocaine at Grateful Dead shows back then?
I don't know.
It doesn't seem like that's the type of drug that, that laid-back crew would do, right? So I don't know. So, there was speculation they were going to buy a large amount of drugs.
Had Donna and Mike ever been involved in drug dealing before?
Not to any significant extent, no. Just very small time, selling a little bit here to your friends, perhaps. But I think Donna, at that point in her life, had become, she went from just being self-destructive, she went from being reckless to self-destructive. She was experimenting, I think, with more different drugs, drinking a lot more. But on the same note, I think Mike was very good for her. He was getting his act together. He went back to school, got his degree, got a great job with the local utility company. I think he was going to have a tremendous impact on her life. And, it's just unfortunate those kids never got a chance to straighten their life out.
What's the age difference between Donna and Mike? She's a little younger?
Yeah, she was 18. He had just turned 21, I think. They were about 2.5, 3 years apart.
Mm-hmm.
So before we get away from the crime scene, can you talk a little bit about the shoes, or rather the lack of shoes that was found or not found with Donna? Because I've seen a significant amount of discussion on the Facebook page about the lack of shoes.
Yeah, yeah. There's one particular user that can't get over the fact that her shoes were gone. I said earlier, Donna was a very earthy girl. She would go without shoes a lot. Now, she was never going to go camping without shoes. I seriously doubt she would have left town without shoes. But her apartment was just yards away. She could walk from, where she was killed to her apartment in probably 2 minutes. It was that close to where she lived. I'm assuming that she left her shoes at her house. There's theory, maybe the guy had a foot fetish who did this to her and stole her shoes as a memento. I don't know. I think that's getting a little bit out there.
Pardon me while I roll my eyes.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, I saw that as a theory, and that didn't feel right.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
When I was talking to investigators, they wanted to make one thing clear to me. Murder is very simple. At the same time, when we started our Facebook group, we didn't want there to be any limitations. We assumed the motto: look under every rock, leave no stone unturned. So we developed topics on anything people wanted to talk about and explore. From Donna's dad being involved in the underworld, and interstate pornography and, drugs or whatever he was into, to pagan biker rituals, or some crazy stuff. And, there was a team of girls. Oh, they were great. They were, at least 2 or 3 of them were former skip tracers. They started digging into everybody. Just looking into relationships.
Good to have these skills.
Yeah, and one of them had tracked down distant relatives of Donna because at this time her mom was dead. Her dad was nowhere to be found or dead. But she reached out. But we wanted people to really have no limits. To where all that information ultimately brought us back to where we are now. I think we have a good focus of where police are looking or need to look.
Well, the other thing, too, is, and we've lived this with the Colonial Parkway murders, I think sometimes we have a tendency, perhaps through the filter of nostalgia or whatever, have a tendency to look back on ourselves as young people and our peers as young people and kind of romanticize it a little bit. The other thing is, these are young people doing young people things. In other words, I worry when you describe Donna moving from reckless to self-destructive, that's frightening, and you hope that she would have been able to step back from that eventually. But at the same time, we can't, look back through this romantic haze and not also talk about things that might be more difficult to talk about because they could be the answer to solving these cases. As the law enforcement people said to you, the Demerol itself could be key. In other words, how did Donna and Mike end up being dosed or dosing themselves with heavy-duty prescription narcotic used in surgery? And it's worth exploring the idea that, how did that happen? Is this idea about raising $2,000 to $5,000 and maybe buying a significant amount of drugs to sell on the Grateful Dead tour? Those are probably things that are worth talking about. These people are long since deceased. If we're going to get to the bottom of what happened to them, we're going to have to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Sure. Yeah, I think the things that are most important are the Demerol, the large amount of cash, or the drugs that cash was intended to buy, because neither were found. There were no drugs and no money found at the crime scene. I think another key is police have looked at the timeline of Mike and Donna as a couple just hours before their death. I think they've looked over the years less at what Donna was doing for those few hours and who she was with before Mike got off work and picked her up, because there's some very interesting stuff going on there. Who knew they had that money? Mm-hmm. Who knew what they were planning to do with that money? And what did Donna do? Who did she talk to just hours before her death? I think that's the key to this case.
Join us again next time as we continue our discussion with Blue Hall and what happened in the Donna Hall Mike Margaret case from 1984 here on Mind Over Murder.
Thanks for joining us.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.